part of the work that God has asked Chris and I to do is to give other people opportunities to share their story. It's an important time for all of us to hear about how God has radically reached into the hearts and lives of different people. And today we have the opportunity to meet Steve. Now, we're going to be recording Steve's story, his testimony, in two parts. This is part one. This is Meet Steve before God started to work in his heart and in his life. And then we will release part two, and that's the story of how God began to change and mold and shape Steve to become the man of God that he is. And so, Steve, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and meeting with us today. And you have so much to offer in terms of life experience, in terms of just the work that God had to do in you to make you an instrument for his gospel and for Jesus.
Amen.
And so let's go ahead and start at the beginning.
Yes.
Steve, if you would, could you share a bit about your early childhood, just in the ways that you're comfortable with?
Sure. Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I thank God, and I thank Chris and Regina for this platform that God has opened. I'll start as a childhood in Los Angeles, California is the only part that I remember. Before that, I was born in the state of Iowa, but my family moved to California when I was 6 months old. So I remember growing up as a little boy in a house that was kind of like Leave It to Beaver. I had an older brother, and I remember being kind of a rambunctious youngster to the point where they had to put a leash around me to keep me from running off and keep me in the yard while my mother did what she did in the house and my dad was at work. But I remember little things like that. I remember a dog that we had named Duke. And I remember my big brother and how I looked up to him, and my dad, of course. So it was a normal Irish Protestant family. We went to church on Sunday, and my mom was very much the instrument that pushed that forward. So I remember going to Sunday school and hearing, Jesus loves me, this I know because the Bible tells me so. And I heard stories about Noah, and I heard stories about different Bible study as a young boy. I remember being baptized. I think I was 7 years old, and baptism meant to me that it was pleasing to my parents. It fit in with what everybody was doing, so I didn't have an understanding of what I was doing, but it was pleasing to my mom, and my buddies were doing it, so I did it. So I was very much involved with the church. It was like a part of my life as far as interacting with other people. The pastor of the church lived 2 houses up from us, so I played with his sons. And one day, I was 8 years old. I woke up and my father wasn't home, and I asked my mother, "Where's Dad at?" And she said, "Oh, he's on a business trip." And I said, "Oh," and you believe what you hear, your mother told you. So it became a week, and then more questions, and then it sunk in because my older brother was telling me, he's not coming back.
Oh.
He's gone. And it rattled me as a little guy, because I looked up to Dad so much that he was my world, you know, he was my example in life. He was the rock, you know. And he had taken me fishing at Big Bear when I was a little boy, and woke up at 4 in the morning and went fishing. And he taught me how to fish and to use a hammer and to do those things that a father teaches a son. And but he never really taught me anything about God. That was my mother's doing, and the church, things I would hear, that God was good. And I never heard that. I heard there was a hell and a heaven, and I heard that there was a God, and that Jesus had come and died for me. I didn't understand it. It was like a story. So anyway, my father left his 2 sons and his mother. My mother was a struggling housewife trying to raise 2 boys, and I could tell that it bothered my mother greatly, that I would hear her crying. And so I tried to be a comfort to her. I remember saying, "Mom, I'll help, you know, I'll do this, I'll do that around the house." And then my brother became angry. He was a young man, but he was 4 years older than I. And he began to tell me that the reason Dad left was because of my mother.
Oh, goodness.
And that she wasn't a good woman. And so he pitted me against my mother. And I looked up to my brother. I listened to him. He was now the mentor in my life to a little boy. And he assured me that Dad cared for us, but that Mom was the villain in the picture.
So, Steve, how old were you at this time?
I was between 8 and 9 years old.
Oh, goodness.
Yes, and I remember going to school. I had to walk to a school that was nearby, Sierra Madre Elementary School. And we lived up in the foothills it's above Pasadena, Monrovia, Arcadia area in Los Angeles County. But I was still going to church. Mother was still taking us to church, and I was involved. But I started becoming rebellious, more and more rebellious, angry, hurt, felt that I must not be worth much if you're going to run off and leave me like that. And then one day I saw a truck back into the house. We had a driveway that went down into the house, and this truck was trying to maneuver that, and it brought my attention. Even as a little boy, I was playing, doing something, and I said, "Yeah, who are you?" And he said, "Oh, I'm the furniture man." And he started loading my bed in the truck, and the couch, and the furniture out of the living room, and the house became empty. And I looked around, and I went, and my mom was crying, and she said, "I can't pay the bill." So they stripped us of all the stuff that my father had gotten on credit. They began to empty the house. So I remember my mother going back to work. She was a school teacher when my father met her. And so she went back and applied for work and started teaching elementary school in Glendale, California. So, yes.
So, you know, the part about your father is such an interesting thing as Chris and I have talked to and gotten to know so many people.
Yes.
That really changes the trajectory of a kid's life.
Yes.
And so as you're looking back on that time, sounds like you were an energetic little guy.
Yes.
I like the story of having to have the little
leash.
strap.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And so you were an energetic little guy, but this marked a point in your life that really started to shape you
Yes.
and mold your opinions and your personality, not only maybe towards men, but also towards women,
Yes.
in the way that your brother set things up with your mother
Yeah.
as being the villain in the story.
Yeah.
And so, Steve, how are you doing in school? Were you in school at this time?
Yes, I was in elementary school. It affected me. And like you said, in many different ways. I noticed my interest in school was getting, it was diminishing. My attention was poor. Uh, I had this confusion going on in me as a little boy of the stability in my life was now taken out. So I was confused, I was hurt, I was angry, I was the very one that gave me life, my mother, was now an instrument of that wound.
Right.
So now I was projecting that. I was defying her. Instead of coming home from school, I was running around doing what I wanted to do. Schoolwork became bad. Uh, I also it affected me so deeply that I had a speech impediment.
Really?
I started stuttering in school, and I had never had that issue. So when it came time in class to read, to stand up and read or to share, I would lock up and I couldn't do it. So the school contacted my mother and said, you know, your son is having like a breakdown and he's unable to participate in class and share. So they signed me up for a speech therapist, and I took speech class, and she was trying to break that barrier that had happened in my life, and I finally got over it, but it was a barrier for about a year. It was a issue that I could not speak. When I was put on the spot, I would just lock up.
Wow.
And it was a form of a breakdown now that I look back at it. And I was just so confused and hurt. And a young man at that age is trying to figure out his identity.
Right.
Who am I?
Right.
You know, and what am I? What do I do in this world, you know? And at that time, I just felt like, to be honest, like useless.
Yeah.
And rejected, and the only voice that I was really listening to was my brother, who was also wounded
Right.
and hurt and abandoned. And so I'm hurt people, and he wasn't good for me. And my mother finally saw it and separated us. She put him into a Texas boys ranch and sent him off to Texas. And then in her attempt to stabilize her life, sent me to South Carolina to a boys' place in South Carolina. I was 12 now.
Oh my goodness.
12 years old, and I'm in another state and nobody. And I was really confused, scared, uh, was approached at 12 years old with homosexual activity by one of the staff that was there, rejected it, started getting in fights because I was picked on for being from California. My speech impediment started kicking in again. I was mocked for that, so I was fighting all the time, and I was winning. So it gave me a sense of, oh, this is who I am. I'm a fighter.
Oh, goodness.
I can do this well, so don't mess with me or I will deal with you kind of attitude. And I walked around with a chip. And pretty soon the staff contacted my mother and said, this little guy is not going to work out here.
Gosh.
And we're sending him home. So I went back to California. She sent me to junior high in Pasadena. I started carrying knives to school. I was fighting all the time. I was seventh grade. I was 6 foot tall.
Yes, I was going to say,
Yes.
for to think of kids and bullying and all the stuff that goes on, you're dealing with your father's disappearance.
Yes.
You're dealing with anger and frustration and blame of your mother. You also have this speech impediment that sounds like maybe it did have some psychological backings and emotional backings to
Yes.
support that. But Steve, I'm sitting here with you, and you're a big guy, and so I was kind of wondering how much bullying
Yes.
happened for
Yes.
you, or was that just something you learned early on, like that's not gonna?
Yeah, it's not going to happen anymore.
Yeah.
I started standing up for myself, and I saw that when I did, that I also got approval by a certain
Right.
group of people
Right.
that were, oh, this guy stands up for himself. He's a fighter, and in that circle, it's sought after.
Right.
It's applauded that this guy will not take no guff. He will fight for himself, stand up for him. And my father taught me that as a young guy. He said, "Don't you ever take an ass whooping, boy."
Okay.
He goes, "You fight for yourself." And as a little boy, I was taught that. So now I'm in this confusion in LA, and I'm taking a bus from the house to Pasadena. I'm, like I said, carrying weapons. I bought a pocket knife, and I'm taking a knife to school with me. And one day, I got into an altercation with a guy that was a senior, and I was a junior or freshman at that time. And I pulled the weapon out and told him, "Come on, let's get busy." And a teacher walked around the corner and saw me.
Oh, goodness.
And she arrested me, took the weapon, took me to the principal's office. They called my mother. They suspended me from school for a week or so. So now I'm a problem. I'm starting to become a problem. And it wasn't soon after that I got caught for shoplifting, for stealing, and taken to the little town jail that they had and put into a cell. And it was supposed to be a scared straight moment for me, to shake me and awaken me that I'm on a wrong path. And my mother came, and now she's going to be the father. She's not called to be. She has to discipline her son. And so she did it the best she knew how. And I saw my mother enraged, and it just verified, see, she is a crazy woman. See, that's why Dad left,
Oh,
is
gosh.
because look how she's acting. She's
Right.
beating you with a stick, and so I became more angry and more bitter, and so now I'm 13.
Okay, so
Yes.
Steve, did you mentioned that your father had taught you early on that you were not going to be, somebody's whipping post.
Right.
And to fight and defend yourself. So somehow did you feel like your father would have been proud of you?
Uh, I think so. I felt that I was representing my
Right.
household. Now I had this, my brother used to tell me, yeah, we're Moors, and
Right.
you represent that. And you're not no little pump. My dad used to call us uh, stud one and stud two.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And he would say things to us like, you don't want to be a pud, you want to be a stud, right?
Okay. And you're
And
8 years old at
yes,
this
yeah.
point. Yeah.
And so he would instill in us that we were supposed to be men, and quit being a whiner and a crybaby, man up. I remember crying when I hurt myself or something, and he would say, man up, And so being a little boy was kind of put out of the picture, and I had to man up.
Right.
And one day I was 13, and a car pulled up, and I looked, and it was a pink Cadillac. And I said, "Who is that?" And it was my dad. And he had gotten the car from his mother, had passed away, and she lived in Hollywood, and she had a pink Cadillac that some man had bought her. So he had her car, and he came, and hey, stud, what's up? And I go, all right, Dad, I was just so, where have you been? And he goes, oh, I live in San Diego now, and I've got a new woman. You got a new mom. You should meet her. And I said, a new mom? And he goes, yeah, she's cool. She ain't nothing like your mother. And so I said, okay. And he goes, come on, where's she at? And I said, at work. He goes, well, let's go. Let's go have lunch. So we went to a restaurant. I remember it was Mexican food. My dad loved Mexican food. And it had beer. So it had liquor. My dad had an issue with liquor. So we got there, and he orders a pitcher of beer with 2 mugs. And I'm 13 years old, and he fills up both mugs, and he slides one over to me, and he goes, go ahead. And I go, wow, this is cool. Dad's letting me drink beer. So I drink a beer, and I'm drunk. I can feel myself, and I'm not normal, and it feels weird. And I thought, wow, this is why they do this, to feel like this, stupid. And so we talked, and he told me, I've got a place for you. Do you want to come and live with me? We live in San Diego, no more smog. He goes, you'll love it. And he goes, and you can do stuff, whatever you want. You got your own room. And so, of course, I'm going to say yes. I go, yeah, now I'm accepted again.
Yeah.
I'm wanted again. So he tells me, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go to court. And he goes, I want you to get up there and you tell them that you want to live with me, that you don't want to live with your mother, but you don't get along with her, and you would do much better with me, and you're at that age you can make that decision in court. So I said, okay, when's that happen? I wanted it now. And he goes, oh, it's going to happen, and I guess it was a month or 2 away. And then he said to me, he smoked. And he goes, you smoke? And I go, yeah. And he goes, I didn't. And he goes, here. And he throws me a pack of cigarettes. Ah, thanks, Dad. So now I'm smoking and drinking. I can do what I want. I got the regulator off me. And my dad had a saying that he instilled in both of us, my brother James and I. you only live once. Pedal to the metal. If it feels good, do it. And women, they cost you money. He goes, so don't get attached. So these were some things, core beliefs that were built into me, along with a lot of other racist beliefs that white people were supreme beings, that we should be running the planet, et cetera, et cetera. And we grew up through the Watts riot, so I saw that in the 60s.
Right, in LA.
Yes, and I heard statements from my father, very racist, hateful, derogatory. So those words are powerful when they come from someone in your life that is supposed to be speaking life into you and good into you. It brought forth a tree of hatred and racism in me. And so I went to court and ended up going to be with my father.
Now, Steve, this is just such an incredible story, because here it sounds like your mother was working hard, doing everything that she knew how to do to try and get her two sons that she loved on this better path. She wanted a good future for you.
Yes.
And your father shows up after being gone for several years and presents this entirely different life of drugs and alcohol and women and hatred and racism. And you, as a young boy, you've been incarcerated briefly for the first time, but you see that as, he wants me. He cares about me.
Exactly.
So I have worth.
Yes.
I have value now.
Yes.
And so you end up, by the court's decision, living with your dad. Did you go back to school? Did you finish high school?
No, I didn't. I went to junior high in San Diego. The transition, I was in Claremont, San Diego. Einstein Junior High, 7th grade. Like I said, I was tall. I was a big guy. So right away I'm into sports and I'm doing well.
Did you play
and
football?
The adjustment, played football, basketball, was in track and field, loved athletics.
Oh, that's good.
And started focusing on that a lot. Then because of that, there's a lot of girls. So I was attracted to one who is the mother of my 2 children now. And we started going out and going to the movies together and doing things. And my father gave me such leeway that we lived in a duplex. And he said, you want a bigger room? And I go, yeah. And he goes, why don't you make that garage out there, which was in the alley. So it was apart from the house completely. And I thought, wow, what freedom I'm going to have now. So I went to that, and black lights and posters, and now I'm smoking weed and drinking out in the garage and bringing girls over all hours of the day and night, because the garage door, and then he caught it, and he said, okay, now I'm going to lock you in. And then, so he would lock me in the garage, but you could push it far enough and crawl out.
If there's a will,
yes,
there's a way.
So I found the way and started sneaking out. I'm running the streets and I'm acting out. And my girlfriend, I get my first car. It's a 58 Chevy Impala. I was so proud of that car. I had to work for it. Dad said, you want a car? You go to work. So I was pumping gas, going to school, pumping gas, trying to navigate life, most of the time high on some type of substance. and my girlfriend comes up pregnant, and I'm 16 years old, and I'm in the 10th grade at Madison High School, and graduated out of Einstein and went to Madison. So I tell my girlfriend we're going to run off.
Oh,
We're gonna go to Mexico, and we got these big ideas that we're gonna go away. So that doesn't happen. Her mother finds out and just raises all kinds of chaos. It gets to my dad. My dad said, "We're moving," and her family had quite a bit of influence. He was a retired Navy vet. My dad was an Army vet, retired. And so he moves us, packs us up, and moves us to Poway.
with your girlfriend who
No,
is
my girlfriend now is
Okay.
staying, right,
Okay.
with her family.
Right.
And they will not let her out of their sight.
They don't want you anywhere near.
They found out that
the girl.
I got their daughter pregnant, and they don't want anything to do with me. And I'm a hoodlum, and you know that. So he moves us to Poway. I start going to Poway High. I am running crazy, driving. She's sneaking out. I'm driving down to Claremont, getting her, and we're running around together. Her parents are they want me in jail.
Right.
And finally, it succeeds. They get me for taking her daughter unlawfully somewhere and without permission, and
Because she's a minor. You're both
we're both
minors.
minors. So they arrest me and they take me to juvenile hall, and my dad comes to the hearing, and I was months away from being 17, and the judge looked at my father and said, "This boy right here is out of control, and if you don't do something with him, I am." And he says, "It's called youth authority, and we're going to put him in the system." And my dad goes, "No, you're not. He's going to the Army." And it was during the Vietnam conflict, started in '68 or so. And so it was right in that time when people were enlisting for the draft. So my father sent me to LA to the recruitment place, and I went through all the testing when I turned 17. He signed the papers, and now I'm in boot camp in the Army.
So there are attempts, minimally by your father, to put restraints on you,
Yes.
and those didn't succeed. And then the court was going to step in and
Yes.
say, okay, we're going to take care of it. And so your father's solution was to let the Army do the discipline
Yes,
and
exactly.
the restraints on your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that was such a crazy, tumultuous time, that time of the Vietnam War, that
Yeah.
affected so many young men and so many families. And so was the Army successful in bringing about this change in your
No.
heart?
In the military, I took my boot camp. My initial training was in Fort Ord, California. At that time of the 60s, we all know were LSD, a lot of pot smoking, free love. And so I was in Carmel and up in Northern California, and we were all taking LSD, not all, but a big majority of us were partying.
Right.
While you're in boot camp, you're not allowed to leave the base. There was a time that you could not. But the minute that restraint was off of us, we were in town drinking. I'm drinking alcohol in bars at 17, 18 years old, and we're doing drugs. I wasn't doing any IV drugs, like I wasn't doing speed or cocaine or heroin, but I was smoking and doing psychedelics and going through training with machine guns, now that I think about it, loaded on drugs.
Right.
And it's only the grace of God someone didn't get hurt. But past my training, was in communications, radios and switchboards and telephones and all that stuff. And sent to Fort Lewis, Washington. And there I continued my drug use. My brother came back into my life when he did a tour in Vietnam and came back to the States for a leave of 30 days. And we did drugs together and partied together, and he told me about Vietnam. Man, you gotta come, bro. And I said, well, I tried. They won't let me go to Vietnam because you're there. And I was the last surviving son, so I couldn't go to Vietnam.
Oh, gosh.
Yes, so that kept
God's
me.
grace.
Yes, God kept me out of Vietnam, so they sent me to South Korea. In South Korea, I did drugs. I started smoking opium. I was smoking weed the whole time I was there, drinking, sleeping with prostitutes, and just doing what was normal for me.
Right. So now, how long were you in the Army?
I went in 69 and got out in 71 of active duty. And then I was in inactive duty till 75.
So you earned an honorable discharge?
Yes, yes.
And so within that, did you ever have a chance to finish high school?
No, at that time,
Right.
no, I didn't.
It wasn't.
No, it wasn't really pushed.
Right.
More was pushed on learning the technology of the day, learning. I had enough sense to be able to function, enough schooling under me that I could function in the communication field that I was in.
Right. Okay, so Steve, you are concluding your military career with an honorable discharge, and you were working in the field of communications. And in the time that I've known you, I can see that you're really a smart man, and yet you opted to go in a different direction as to how you were going to use your intelligence and what choices you were going to make next in life. So what happened after you were out of the Army and you no longer had the structure that was trying to restrict some of your tendencies?
Yeah. Well, I recall getting out of the military and my brother meeting me at the airport in San Diego. It was like a celebration, you know, big brother's coming to pick up little brother who's just come back from overseas. And so he came prepared. He came with goods, drugs. And he's living in a house in Escondido, dealing drugs, and in the drywall field. So he meets me at the airport, pops a hit of acid in my mouth, LSD for you that don't understand that. And so by the time I'm getting to Escondido, I'm coming onto this LSD, and it's heavy psychedelic experience. People are turning into characters, and and he's laughing, and I'm looking at the living situation, and he goes, "Hey, I hear your girlfriend, the one that had your kid." And I go, "She had the kid?" And he goes, "Yeah, you got a little boy that's 3 years old."
Oh, goodness.
And I go, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah, his name is Jason." And he goes, "I saw him, man. He's a cool little guy." And he goes, "You know what? Why don't you go see her?" And he throws me the keys to his car. So I call her up and we make an arrangement. And I go down there and I meet my son, who at the time was 3 years old. And he doesn't know who I am. and somebody else has been raising him. She got married after I left, and her parents kind of forced her into a marriage so that it wouldn't be any disgrace on their household. So she married this guy that was in the Navy and already divorced him. So she's living by herself, and I go to the house, and we're kind of making amends for time apart. And the next thing I know, she's making plans for us. And I'm like, boy, this is moving fast. And why don't you move in? And, you know, why do you live with your brother? Move in with me. So the next thing I know, I am doing that. So we're living in a house, and my brother's into drywall. I have the VA behind me, which will pay for schooling. So I look in, because I'm a communication operator, I look into Bell Telephone to work for that company. The waiting list is miles long, years long. Family members get in there and take care of family members. So it's a real hard field to get into. So I'm a 21-year-old guy, fresh out of the military with a 3-year-old son. I'm a kid, trying to raise a kid, got a woman who's got a job, but I need a job. So I get into the drywall field my brother's in. And the VA pays for my schooling. I go to night school. I learn painting, decorating, and drywall, finishing. So I'm going to Mesa College at night, and I'm working as an apprentice, join the union. I'm making some pretty decent money for the 70s, 71. Started out then, I think the minimum wage was $4.75 or something an hour, and I was making that. My wife was bringing in $12 an hour, and as a key punch operator. But as I got more into it, I said, you know what, these guys are making $12, $15 an hour that know this trade. I better pay attention. So I started really applying myself. Before long, I was making that kind of money. And then came the dry season, where it's raining and there is no drywall when it rains. There has to be roofs on the houses before the drywall can go in. So the work is slowed down. I'm in the union, I'm getting unemployment, but I still have rent, and I have all these payments on a car and a motorcycle and a truck. And so I start dabbling in drugs and selling drugs. My brother's doing it. So I end up getting a connection in Tijuana. I start running heroin across the border. Pretty soon I'm selling heroin. I'm living over in North Park, and I'm selling heroin, and one night the police come. And I had sold to a undercover agent that I did not know, who was brought to me by someone, and they came back with a marked bill and were going to charge me for sales of a controlled substance. And there was 2 people in the house that were ex-cons that were just got out of prison and done an armed robbery. And so they're on the run. They're in the house. There's a 17-year-old in there with them doing drugs. So now I have a house full of felons, wanted felons. Drugs are being sold out of this house. It's my first encounter with the law, serious stuff, and I'm in the county jail with all these charges: armed robbery, maintaining a house where drugs are used and sold, paraphernalia. My wife at the time took the drugs that was on the table when they were at the door, put them under the dishes in the sink, and they never found them. But they tore the house apart, locked us both, all of us up, left my dog in the house, uncared for. We're in jail for 3 days. They released me on my own reconnaissance and tell me to report to court on this date. Well, I kicked heroin for the first time in jail and had a horrendous habit. And when I was in the county jail, I was throwing up and chills and remembering going, my goodness, I didn't know it was like this. And I realized just how terrible drug addiction was. But I went back to the house, made the phone call. My wife was at her parents', and I said, where are the drugs? And she said, they're in the sink. And I went right back to the drugs and began using again. And this vicious cycle kept going. Then they finally arrested me for some burglaries and attempted incarceration to get me back on track, and it didn't work. I went to jail, got out of jail again after a year, and got right back into the drugs and the crime. This time picked up a gun and started robbery as a source of income, and drug sales and armed robbery.
To conclude this first part of Meet Steve, we see that Steve's life had taken a number of surprising turns. And although there were efforts by people who loved him and by the courts and even the army to redirect his life and get him on a straight and narrow path that leads to salvation, he was not at a point at all that he was willing to listen. And as dark as his life is at this point, having been incarcerated and facing serious felonies at this point, Steve still refused to listen, and he still held on to that hardened, angry heart that had become so much a part of his life and his personality.
Yeah.
Make sure and watch Meet Steve Part 2, where you'll begin to hear how God radically transforms his life and begins to change him from the inside out.
Yes.
Thanks, Steve.
Hallelujah. Yes. That's good stuff. Go.
Now we're
Okay,
at
the end. That's the end. Okay, so that was the end of the
All right,
first
that
one.
was good. That
Yeah.
was a really good ending.
Yeah, that, and he can just
You did that
tag
like
it on
a
there.
pro.
Well, I have help in high places.
Didn't she? She did it like a pro.
Yeah, she amazing.
You did it like a
Oh,
newscaster.
there you go. So,
That was Dateline right there.
click.